and retails. Dr. Milena currently works as a research scientist at the MIT Center for Transport and Logistics, and currently leads the MIT Supply Chain Design Lab. It's my pleasure to hand over the virtual lectern to Dr. Milena as she takes us through last mile strategies in pharmaceutical sector. You will recall that we've had Dr. Jackson earlier in the year, sometimes last year. And I'm sure that you'll find a way to make the connection between what we'll be learning from Dr. Milena and what we had learned earlier. So with an IAPHL energy, let us welcome Dr. Milena. Welcome. Up to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimmy, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here to share some of the work that we have been doing in this area. So I will be talking today about the last mile strategies, and specifically about what we call new generation of last mile innovations for the pharma center. And I'll be relying on the project work that we've done with several large pharma manufacturers here at the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. So just before I go into the core of the subject, so just a short intro on the lab that I'm leading. So I'm leading the supply chain design lab, and you can find the link here if you would like to get more information about this type of work or other type of work that we do. Basically, the supply chain design lab is working with several large companies, and the way that we approach supply chain design is essentially through two main components, two main dimensions. So the first one is what you would sort of expect from a research institution as ours. So we develop quantitative models to essentially better support decision-making in supply chain design. And so that can be optimization models, that can be simulation models, machine learning models, whatever is relevant for a specific topic that we're working on. And then the second pillar is we work on incorporating those models into essentially visual interactive tools. So here we have example of actual the Cave Lab at MIT, where you can have decision makers interacting in real time with those models and making decisions. And the reason why I highlight this is that you will see that throughout this presentation, when we talk about these new last mile strategies, there will essentially be a need to facilitate this type of interactive, facilitated decision-making process, rather than a pure expert mode exploration of the different solutions. So that's a bit of a context about the lab. Now, let's go directly into our topic. So first, let's kind of lay out the context in which we're operating. So why do we see the emergence of last mile innovations in the pharma sector? So there's going to be a few industry trends that are leading this. So one of them is increased market competition. So the availability of alternative drug substitutes in many therapeutical areas. We also see there's going to be a shift from what we call blockbuster mass market drugs towards more specialized boutique drugs that are now specific to certain populations or subpopulations. So the patient groups become smaller and smaller in terms of who we need to target. And then we also have the advanced technologies that enable the rise of precision and personalized medicine. So one extreme of that would be considering, for example, cell and gene therapy. And so if we look at that, all of those different elements of the context, well, the last mile strategies and specifically what we call patient-centric strategies are becoming a key driver of the competitive advantage for the companies. And so now a lot of the companies are going to be engaging in a thought process of essentially understanding what specific last mile strategies are going to be most appropriate for the products and markets that they are serving.
Big one. It's like a 7 or 8 footer.
Oh.
All right, so this slide essentially highlights everything that I will be covering today, and it breaks down what we call a traditional approach and compares it to the patient-centric approach according to a number of different dimensions. So the traditional approach, you can think about your traditional distributor model with focus on cost minimization and traditional ways of reaching the patients. And then we have our patient-centric approach, and that is what we'll be discussing today. So you can see that these two models, these two approaches essentially vary according to a number of different dimensions. And what we'll do now is we'll go through them one by one, and I'll provide you some examples of how those materialize in the type of projects, in the type of work that we've been doing. So the first dimension is really the distribution channels that we are using to reach the final patient. So our traditional distributor model will have a centralized approach, typically where we have manufacturing producing medication in bulk and then shipping them to a limited number of regional or local distributors that will then have maybe a couple of different ways of reaching the patients. For a lot of the formulations, we will have either pharmaceutical or hospital delivery, and then for a lot of them, we'll have deliveries in the administration that happens at a hospital. Now, if we look at the patient-centric pharma supply chains, the next slide here provides you just some examples of strategies that we have observed when working with the companies. So all of these are based on real strategies that we were able to see. And you can see already that you have quite some variety in terms of the way that we are reaching our final patient. And so we are, in the beginning, starting with a global warehouse, typically going to a local warehouse, but then we can deliver towards hospitals, towards pharmacy or other near home locations. We have home delivery, and then we can have the administration, which is here with this
But akwai
bubble
samun condom from other
that
places.
can
You
appear.
can see how a samu condom from other
I
places.
apologize, Dr. Milena. Ahmed, can you please mute your mic? And can everyone please just mute? Thank you. It's back to you, Milena.
No worries. It's a large group. This always happens. So we have administration that can appear at multiple points in our network. And so a few things to note here is that the new formulations that we have for some products, so for example, having access to auto injectors, really is going to be enabling some of these last mile strategies. So when we talk about a last mile strategy, it always comes in combination with a certain type of formulation. So if you are thinking of a typical IV formulation, well, you're pretty much limited in terms of the strategies that you can propose. The second thing that we can note is that we have emergence of new players. So we'll have specialized pharmacies, online pharmacies, and essentially new players that are enabling some of these more patient-centric strategies. And then the last one is that the digital capabilities are enhancing this at-home treatments by supporting proper dosing, monitoring frequency, and ensuring compliance. Now, when given a choice between all of the different possibilities to reach the patient, now the question is, how do we select the one that best meets both the needs of the company, the needs of the patients, and other players in the market. And so that's what we'll be discussing in the next part of the presentation. So when we look at the way that we define success and define the objectives in our traditional pharma approach, well, typically we had very clearly defined objectives. For example, cost minimization or focus on efficiency. And so we had typically demands that we needed to serve maybe at the level of hospitals or at the level of different pharmacies. And then the objective was to essentially serve that demand in the most efficient way, and that led us to these centralized networks and the traditional distributed model that we already mentioned.
Sandra?
Of course, there are going to be, in a lot of cases, some constraints in terms of service levels that we want to
Continue. Continue. Yeah.
Hi,
Sandra?
hi, Milka.
Sandra,
Hi, Milka. Can you please mute? Thank you.
Okay. We in the traditional approach, we're working with these very clearly defined objectives. Now, when we think about these new patient-centric pharma supply chains, the number of objectives and the trade-offs that we need to consider is going to be much, much higher. And I'll give you some examples of what that can look like in a specific case of a company that we worked with. So this is just an illustration of what we mean. So here we worked with a large pharma manufacturer that was looking into strategies to enter a new market. And so typically what they would do, they would have a European distribution center and then a local distribution center. And then from the local distribution center, they would essentially go towards a variety of different health funds that had their own warehouses. They would deliver to what we call district pharmacies, and then from those district pharmacies, we would go to the local pharmacies. And so you can see we have a multi-tier structure where we have a lot of different stock points, keeping points in our network. And so they envisioned several channels that they want to include into this analysis.
All right.
And the first channel that they envisioned was essentially, can we bypass some of these nodes that we have in the network? So rather than going through these local warehouses and district pharmacies, can we have directly this delivery from a local DC to the local pharmacy? And we'll call this a direct-to-pharma approach, for example. And then a third approach that they considered was essentially home delivery, where we had one of those specialized market players, which was essentially an online pharmacy, that would propose what is very much a white glove delivery towards the final patient. And so essentially, they identified 3 different paths, and now our role was to assess those different paths according to a number of different objectives that they have formulated. So to do that, we developed a simulation model, and then we incorporated that into a decision-making tool, into an interactive visual tool like the one that I showed you in the first slides of this presentation. And we'll see what are some of the benefits of this approach in a few slides. Now, as I mentioned, we defined several dimensions on which we wanted to evaluate these different channel strategies. So this is really often the most critical and the most important part of the exercise, because essentially we are defining what defines success for our different last mile strategy possibilities. And so here you can see that we have the 3 different paths: traditional path, direct path, and home delivery. Those are the ones that we mentioned today. And then we also have 4 different objectives and 4 different KPIs that we establish as important in collaboration with the company. So the first one was the distribution cost. That one is self-explanatory. Then we had the lead time for the customer, so how fast can we reach customers through the different paths in our network. We had inventory. That was actually quite an important element given the fact that this was a high-value drug. And then we had a customer satisfaction or preference for the different channel strategies that were proposed to them. Now you can see here very clearly that the first three KPIs, so cost, lead time, and inventory, are pretty much the things you would expect from a typical supply chain design, last mile channel strategy optimization. And these are quantitative things that we can essentially model and simulate with the type of tools that we produce. Now, when it comes to customer satisfaction, that is a more qualitative element, and we'll need to get additional data sources to essentially establish what are the preferences of different customers for the different paths. So now, once we have established this type of essentially conceptual model, what we can do is we can fill out this matrix with different evaluation. And so essentially what happens is that for each path and each KPI that we have, we'll evaluate the traditional path according to the cost, the direct path according to the cost, home delivery according to the cost, et cetera, et cetera. And we will do that across the board. And you can see that some of these things are in dollars, others in days, others in units, and the customer satisfaction is essentially just on a scale between 0 and 10. Now, if you perform this exercise, what you can see right away is that there's not going to be a single solution that outperforms all of the other solutions on all of the different criteria that we are considering. So, for example, my traditional path here has the best performance in terms of cost, but the worst performance in terms of the lead time. Home delivery, on the other hand, has the best performance in terms of lead time, but the worst performance according to the cost. And so essentially, if we had one line here that was entirely green, and we were able to say that one path, one scenario has the best performance on all of the KPIs, we could pretty much stop there and select that as the optimal scenario and optimal path to market. But that is actually very rarely the case. That is very rarely the case that we will have that type of result. And so there are some trade-offs to be considered. And so how do we consider those trade-offs? Well, typically, when you look at a problem like this, which is a multi-criteria decision-making problem, there are going to be a number of different ways to assign some level of importance or some weight to the different criteria. And so, for example, if I say that my highest importance is on cost, I will favor my traditional path. If I say that my highest importance is on the lead time, I will favor my home delivery. Now, if you have only a couple of criteria, you can kind of do that by hand, but as the number of criteria grows, you might want to explore different possibilities of those weights and see how these impact the recommendation. So this is kind of what we did here. So in one of those decision support tools, interactive decision support tools that we built for the company, we essentially enabled them to define what criteria they want to look at. So cost, inventory, lead time, or customer preferences, and then essentially to play around with the weights that they are attributing and associating with those different criteria. And what this is going to do is essentially it is going to aggregate all of the results that we had from this previous slide, so all of these evaluations, and it will provide us a single score on a scale between 0 and 100 on what is the overall performance of a given scenario according to the weights that we have defined. Now, often this is where a lot of the discussion happens because someone has to essentially say, how much do we value cost versus customer preferences? And those are typically not easy discussions to be had. And you might have different stakeholders from different parts of the company that might have different opinions about, of course, what is the key driver of the decision. Now, the beauty here of the approach that we had with the interactive tool was that we were actually quickly able to establish that the exact weighting of these criteria in this specific case didn't actually matter so much. And so we were playing around with different sets of weights with varying importance to the different objectives, and we would essentially consistently get the same recommendation in terms of what should be the optimal path. And this is what we're showing here. So here we are essentially saying, okay, let's say I put 100% of weight on the cost and then 0% everywhere else. Or, we can consider another scenario where I put 100% on the satisfaction and then 0% everywhere else. And then all of the other combinations here are essentially somewhere in between. And so what we can do is, for each set of weights that we have defined here, we can say, what is the performance, what is the total score that we get for the 3 different scenarios that we're considering. And the result looks something like this. So you see here, as expected, if I only care about cost, I should go with my traditional path. This one has the highest score from all of the different possibilities. If I only care about customer satisfaction, I should go with home delivery. But then we see actually there's a huge range here of the ways in which we can vary different weights and incorporate them into this evaluation model that all provide us the same recommendation, which is let's go with the direct path, which is essentially the traditional path without all of those different intermediate steps. And so now this is interesting because now the conversation doesn't become, okay, should we put 20 or 25% here on the lead time versus the inventory? And that's, a conversation that we can have for multiple hours if we're in a room with several decision makers. It just becomes within this different possibilities in what is the range in which we're operating. And in this specific case, the company said, yes, we care about all of these things quite a bit, not only about cost, not only about satisfaction, and therefore it doesn't actually matter what is the exact weighting that we propose for all of the different submetrics. We know that the direct path is providing us the most robust recommendation in most cases. And so in this case, it was actually pretty straightforward to converge towards a single decision, even though we had all of these different trade-offs to consider between different objectives. So that's an example of how the change from this traditional to the patient-centric approach changes the way that we need to approach the evaluation. So we are no longer trying to maximize or minimize a single value such as cost or customer satisfaction. We really need to somehow incorporate the tension that can exist between different objectives and the trade-offs that may exist between them. Now, I hinted earlier on the fact that some of the KPIs that we have defined, such as cost, lead time, and inventory, were, let's say, expected from the type of study that we would do here. And they were expected, and also we had quite some data to be able to support the simulation and the evaluation of those different metrics. So, we can have historical data on the deliveries, we could have data that enables us to model the costs that is associated with different operations in the supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. And so typically in the traditional approach, and for these more of the traditional KPIs, we can heavily rely on operational supply chain data to perform this type of evaluation. Now, when we are moving towards the patient-centric approach, that is obviously no longer sufficient because now we need to also incorporate some data on the customer preferences. And so in the example that I shared here, we essentially just relied on a survey that was made among different customers on what their preferences were in the specific, for the specific paths that we were proposing to them. In other cases, it is going to be a bit harder to get that type of information. And I will show you an example here. So this is another example of the work that we did with the pharma company. We are again considering a new product launch and we are selecting now between two different strategies. So one of them is hospital administration. So we have your typical delivery towards the hospitals, and then the patients that travel to the hospital to receive their drug. And then the second one is the home delivery. Now, the subtlety here is that the strategies may vary according to the region or the county of the country that we are considering. So if you think about, for example, the preference that we might have for the home delivery versus hospital administration, well, if I live, 1 kilometer or 5 kilometers from a hospital, I might be pretty open to go to that hospital and actually prefer to get my drug delivered over there. If I live, 100 kilometers from a hospital, and that involves taking multiple public transit to reach the hospital, I'll have a much more clear preference for the home deliveries. And so we couldn't just say that the entire patient population here would have the same preferences, and we need to find essentially a different way of considering those preferences and incorporating that into our model. Now, in this specific case, we also had to deal with the fact that we had a lack of available data on these patient preferences, and so we had to essentially formulate multiple scenarios in order to obtain this type of information. And so what that will look like is something like this. So you can see here, all of the little X's are essentially the hospitals where we can get the drugs administered. And so as expected, when I am very close to the urban areas, I have a very high density of the hospitals. And then if you are here in the southern part of the country, you are likely to travel very long distances just to get access to your healthcare provider. And so what we did here is essentially we said, okay, let's take all of our different regions and let's characterize how close or how far we are from a nearest hospital. And then rather than considering the preferences for a given channel in a homogeneous manner, let's say for each segment of population, according to how close or far they are from a hospital, let's define the level of preference that they might have for one channel or the other channel. And so, for example, here we said, okay, if I am in a patient that is very close to the hospital, between 0 and 5 kilometers, we estimate that 30% of them will prefer the hospital, the home delivery. Now, if I am at 50 kilometers or more, there will have a much larger share of the patients that will prefer that type of channel strategy. And so you can essentially define different curves here that describe how the patient preferences for different channels evolve according to where they are located in the country and what kind of accessibility segment they are part of. Now, what that provides as a result is once we define these weights, so for example, the weight for the cost and customer satisfaction, we can now get a different recommendation for each one of the parts of the country that we are considering. And so, for example, you'll see here that in some regions we will have 100% home delivery, in others we will have a mix between home delivery and hospital administration, and then in the other ones we will have purely our hospital administration. And so we can get a much more granular view of what should be the optimal channel strategy according to the region that we are considering. Now, all of this, of course, is very much outside of the realm of the operational supply chain data. And so if you want to work with this patient-centric pharma supply chain, it's really crucial to get somewhat reliable and somewhat useful information on the customer preferences that you can consider. That is often the biggest challenge because it really brings us, both the researchers and the companies that are working with us, I would say outside of our comfort zone, because we are typically not used to making large-scale surveys, for example, from different populations to get this type of data. Now, these are a few dimensions that we mentioned so far. One additional dimension that I want to address is what are the stakeholders that are involved in the decision-making process. So if I am in a traditional approach, so I'm looking at my distributor model optimized for cost efficiency using operational supply chain data, typically what we will end up is what we call a siloed approach. And the siloed approach actually means two different things in this context. So on the one hand, when you look at the decision makers within the company, so within the pharmaceutical company, you will typically have, for example, the logistics and the supply chain department that will be responsible for establishing these last mile distribution strategies. If you look at the KPIs that we mentioned here, well, your supply chain department probably has a pretty good idea on what the cost, lead time, and inventory is for a given scenario. But again, they'll have a much harder time providing information on what is the level of customer satisfaction for the different strategies. And so even when you look at a single company, once you move towards these more patient-centric oriented approaches, you typically want to involve other parts of the organization, so typically sales, marketing, market access, or other parts of organization that can kind of represent this part of the equation. Now, the second thing that happens, and that's something that actually we realized very quickly after we did the few of the proof of concept studies that we were presented in the previous slides here, is that when you are thinking about these patient-centric pharma supply chains, you can't have an approach that is totally agnostic of the broader healthcare system in which we are operating. So far we've been looking at KPIs that are relevant to the company and some KPIs that are relevant to the patients. But there's actually going to be a number of additional stakeholders that can be the local healthcare providers, healthcare authorities, the insurance companies, etc., that essentially do have some say and some power over what are the different paths and strategies that we would want to promote in a given market. And so what that means is that we are starting to essentially increase the number of dimensions of performance that we want to look at. And so we have our traditional KPIs, such as distribution cost, market share, revenue, and then we're starting to have a number of KPIs that are relevant to the patient. So the travel distance, the travel time, the time for travel and administration, some KPIs that are relevant to the healthcare providers. So what is the cost for the healthcare providers? What are the resources? So for example, how many nursing hours do we need to put in place to enable these different strategies? What is the utilization of the different hospitals, for example? And then we also have a number of KPIs that are relevant to the third-party payers. Now, this is by no means a comprehensive list of all of the different KPIs, and really depending on each country and each market where we're operating, this list is going to be somewhat different. But in any case, we'll essentially start applying the number of dimensions that we are considering. Now, this is what our analysis could look like right now. So let's say I have now 3 different paths. So one of them is an IV administered at a hospital. The second one is auto-injector in the pharmacy. And the third one is auto-injector in the home delivery. And then we can have a number of different KPIs that we select that are relevant for our analysis. And so as previously, we can assess all of the different KPIs for all of the different paths. And, I'll get, for example, my IV at a hospital that is the most cost effective. And then my home delivery that provides me the biggest market share, et cetera, et cetera. So this essentially looks very familiar to the table that we previously had. Now, one distinction here is that we can't simply take all of the different KPIs and put some weights on those KPIs and then aggregate those KPIs. And the reason why we can't do that is that essentially, when you look at these KPIs, you realize very quickly that they are relevant to different players in our network. And so if I just simply aggregate everything, I might end up with a solution that has very good performance according to, KPIs relevant to the pharma company, but very bad performance according to some of the KPIs that are relevant to the insurance companies in that country, for example. And so the simple aggregation is essentially no longer sufficient when you are extending the number of actors and the numbers of points of view that we are trying to consider. And then the other thing that also happens is that even when we look at some of these individual KPIs, so for example, average distance per patient, well, depending on where you're in the country, you can see here I have a lot of red, which means I'm traveling pretty far away, and then the green, I'm very close to a hospital. There's going to be some geographical distribution that essentially changes even for these individual KPIs that we consider. Now, this can often lead to, I would say, an overwhelming amount of data that different companies and decision makers need to consider. And it certainly puts us in a place where we can no longer say, we have an optimization model or a simulation model, and that optimization model is essentially going to prescribe us the best solution, because the best solution essentially depends on, who are the different stakeholders that we want to consider, what importance do they have in the final decision, what are some of the interactions that are happening between them, et cetera, et cetera. And so that means essentially that we need to move away from what we call an expert mode, where you have essentially a model that represents a supply chain system of a kind, and then we just put in all of the different parameters, all of the different objectives, and we provide the optimal solution. And we are moving towards what we call facilitated design. And facilitated design, that's really where this visual interactive interfaces come into play, because basically what they enable you to do is essentially put all of the stakeholders that are relevant to decision around the table. So here you can see they're actually around the physical table that also allows them to interact with the model, and to converge towards solutions that best represent the different points of views and the different interests of all of the different stakeholders according to all of the dimensions that they have been able to put forward. And now, what typically happens is that if you just put everyone together and you let the decision, you will have some of the group dynamics that might impact what comes out of this type of discussion. And in order to essentially reduce the bias that can come from some of these group dynamics, so some people, for example, being more prone to speak and take place in the discussion, what we typically have is a facilitator, and so that will be essentially a person who's trained in facilitating group decision makers that will lead this process, and that allows us to ensure that there's going to be a fair process to arrive to the final decision. Now, this type of discussion and this type of exercise can happen at multiple levels. It can happen if we have multiple stakeholders from the same company. So we had, for example, cases where we had supply chain, marketing, finance, and other parts of organizations that were represented in the room, and we were essentially trying to find a solution that best performed for that company according to all of the different metrics that they individually had as important. But it can also happen when considering stakeholders outside of the company, so healthcare authorities, healthcare providers, et cetera, et cetera. And last thing to note here is that the tools that we put in place here and that are essentially made to perform different evaluation, simulation, optimization, or whatever we decide we need to do for a specific case, they are no longer treated as decision support or decision-making tools. So we are not letting the model, we are not letting the tools make the decision. They are only there as a learning tool to essentially investigate what are the different trade-offs, etc. But the actual decision-making process is very much made and run by human decision makers who will finally be accountable for the type of decisions that we make here. And so that's a summary of some of the different elements that we find different between the traditional and these patient-centric approaches. I know there was probably a lot of information. I think we still have some time for some questions. Thank you for your attention, and thank you again for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Milena. We really appreciate you taking the time to prepare and share all of this detailed information with us. We are short on time, definitely, but we have a couple of questions already waiting for you. I will not attempt to read the question. I would try to call on the individuals to quickly engage you with the questions and see how we can quickly wrap up. Thank you for accepting to do that. Yes, the first person is Magiteru, right? Magiteru. No, not Magiteru. Zuberu. Zuberu, do you want to quickly engage Milena? The question is how do you have you considered the constraint of the patient-centric model in public health settings, especially? There was a related question down there, but I want to give the opportunity to Zuberu first. Zuberu, do you want to speak to this? Okay. If Zuberu is not there, I can see Chen Chen. Chen Chen, do you want to speak to this? You have a similar question.
Yeah, hi, Milena. So I just want to ask you, based on your experience, like the 3 channels that you talked about, which one will have a higher resilience against natural disasters? Like when natural disasters strike, the road are blocked, stuff like that happens. So which one or which combination will be working or functioning better under those extreme circumstances?
Yeah, so that's a really good question that I fortunately am definitely not the right person to answer that. I would say my intuition as a supply chain professional would be to say that the diversifying channels is probably the best protection. Now there is a dedicated team that we have at the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics, which is essentially looking at humanitarian logistics and disaster relief. And so they would definitely be able to provide you a more informed answer to this. We were essentially looking more in terms of kind of business as usual operations in the work that we did.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. I will pass it on to Barry. Barry, are you there? You have a very long comment, and I think it's an extension of what we have from Zuberu. It's good to see you, Barry.
Hey, pleasure to see you as well, Timmy. I guess I was just thinking, I've always found this term last mile to be somewhat of a misnomer. I don't think there's no supply chain that isn't interested in getting its goods to a client. In fact, a supply chain that doesn't reach the last mile that's not a supply chain, right? But what I think you've done a lot here is you've used the words market and channel quite a bit, which I think imply that this is a marketing decision, right? I don't know that I love the traditional versus patient-centric, because again, I also think that ministries don't think that they're not patient-centric. And so I feel like that's a bit of a, like a little, you know, like, oh, you're not patient-centric enough, right? But it also seems to me that it's a big decision for the ministry to decide to use these alternative channels for their distribution. And I think bringing it back to Zubaira's question, it's like, is there enough product in the public health system, in the standalone facilities that the government itself owns, to also be able to provide product to these private sector facilities, because they're all going to have to hold some sort of safety stock. And I suppose that's my question in terms of the, and I think that also then comes up under Tom's question about the cost, because you'd think that the government would import it, it would go to the central warehouse, and then as it goes through the supply chain, it goes now not just to the government facilities, but to this bigger channel. And I think at some point, there might not be enough stuff to fill that pipeline so that everybody's got some. And so I think government says, well, we're going to hold our stuff in our buildings, and kind of everybody else is welcome to import, but that's not our stuff. So I just wondered if you had a thought about some of that idea.
Yeah, so quite frankly, it's so what you mentioned, I think that there's a lot of truth in that. I think it's also very hard for us to formulate any general conclusions with regards to, okay, this is a strategy that works for better, I don't know, resilience or something like that. We really notice that the type of drug, the type of patient population, the market or the country where you're working at really has a huge impact on what you are suggesting. So I don't think that we're in a position to say to favor one specific strategy. And your point about saying patient-centric versus non-patient-centric, I absolutely get that criticism. But what we can propose is, okay, what is the process that you need to follow when you want to decide on the different on the best strategy appropriate for what market? And so there we can prescribe a process that says, okay, you're first conceptualizing your stakeholders, their objectives, finding KPIs, finding ways to measure those KPIs, having this facilitated co-design process, et cetera, and then inevitably, in most cases, you will end up with very market-specific, country-specific, or drug-specific solutions that might be completely different from one case to another. But the process is something that we believe can help.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. Tom Jackson had a similar comment. Do you want to speak further about the costs?
Yes, so thank you for sharing. I find this very interesting, thinking about how we can do things more efficiently, more effectively. And I was just wondering, when I looked at the traditional method and, lowest cost leader. So low cost leader, yay for traditional method. But I also noticed you carry a whole lot of inventory under the traditional method. So when you're calculating your cost, you also include the cost of the inventory that must be held to keep those delivery costs lower. I mean, what is encompassed in your definition of delivery cost?
Yeah, and then again, so even in the two examples that I've shown here, the way that we define the cost is going to be different. In the first one, we had cost and inventory as two different components, essentially. And then in the second one, we had the cost that essentially incorporated the total cost to serve. The phase, and I might have gone through this a bit quickly. The first phase where we say, these are the alternatives and these are the dimensions of the performance, that is maybe the most important part of the exercise, where you're essentially trying to elicit what are you trying to optimize for, what does a success look like, and what are the different KPIs. And what our typical way of doing it is to try to match that as closely as possible to whatever are the ways that a given company or organization is currently thinking about their KPIs. So if they're thinking about cost and inventory in separate terms and as two different dimensions, then we essentially replicate that in our tools and in our models. We try to push them, of course, towards something that we think might encompass better some of the trade-offs that might exist. But since the ultimate decision is going to be made by not a model, but a human decision maker, it's really important for us to essentially match even the vocabulary and those definitions to the ones that are currently being utilized so that they can recognize the solutions according to the way that they are thinking about the problem. So
Yeah,
I'm not
so
sure if that answers the question, but
yeah,
yeah.
I think what you're saying is that whoever that you're working with, they set the parameters and the conditions for, running the model and discovering what it is that they want to discover.
Yeah, and it's a bit of an iterative process as well, because
Yeah.
typically you will have one definition, and then you'll realize that actually no, like I'm having now the cost that it will not give you the expected result, and then you iterate on that. But yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Dr. Milena. Okay, we are just about time now. We may not be able to take further questions because we just have 1 minute more. But I just want to say thank you first of all to Dr. Milena for sharing this with us. And you have shared very valid points with us. And I'm sure my colleagues on the call and some that will be listening to the recording may have further questions. Please accord us the opportunity to get back to you with some more questions as we make progress together. I just want to say thank you to everyone who found time to join, especially given the glitch that we had. We really appreciate the resilience and the agility of everyone on the call. Thank you so much. You can unmute now and just say hello to your friend before you take off. Mubarak, it's good to see you.
Thank you, Oga Timmy.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Well done. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Muhammad.
Thank you for Timmy
Thank
for
you,
organizing
everyone.
this. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Take
Dennis.
care.
Thank you, everyone.
Antonia.
Dr.
Thank you.
Milena.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Milena.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Abdudahi.
Thank you.
Abduhadi.
Take
Thank
care.
you. Thank you, Anna.
Timmy, would we have access to the presentation?
Oh, yes. We'll get the presentation and the recording across to the entire community.
Oh,
And if you
Perfect.
don't get it in 24 hours, you can personally reach out to me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
Thank you.
putting this together. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Amino. Pascal. Thank you. Thank you, Pascal. All right. Thank you very much. It's 1 minute past the time now. We'll take the liberty to end the call and see you again next month for another call.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Milena. Bye-bye.